Welcome, my friends, to another episode of Shoot First, Ask Questions Later. Today, we have the privilege of being joined by Rabbi Dr. Tzvi Sinensky, and he is the director of the Lamm Legacy Project and director of Judaic Studies at Mainline Classical Academy. He also works as an independent editor of scholarly Jewish works and lives in the Lower Merion, Pennsylvania area with his wife and children. I should say we're doing this on the Zoom, on the computer, but we're both in Pennsylvania, so God willing, we'll be able to get together soon in person. Now, in the meantime, what today's episode is going to be about is actually about your expertise in Rabbi Norman Lamm that we'll speak about in a moment. I knew it was either between that or it was doing something on the topic of lo yilvash and cross-dressing. To our listeners who are not familiar, I think our first go at it, significant go at it, was probably when several years ago, I decided just to pen a fun article about, not fun, but, a small article about cross-dressing and halacha and Jewish thought. And I put it out there thinking maybe I had something original to share. And lo and behold, I realized I committed an act not only of hasagas gvul, but of a presumptuous hasagas gvul. And I went into the realm and dominion of Rabbi Dr. Sinensky, whose dissertation was on cross-dressing in Judaism.
That's what you get. I'm not an academic by training, but when you cross into my area, you know what you're going to get. So
yeah, that was on me, and so it's all online over there. I got my first official rejoinder, which I think you've made it. If someone gives a rejoinder in 10th grade, I wrote something that my Rebbe put in Heroism, and that's when I knew that I made it. So I just put it as another feather in my hat. But anyway, maybe that's for another episode. But today we're actually going to be looking at what we'll call, I guess, a tshuva of Rabbi Norman Lamm about the topic of whether a kohen who does not observe Shabbos can duchen, can recite the kohanic blessings for the congregation. So I think this is a great episode, not just for the topic, which of course is interesting and has wide implications, but I would actually like to hear a little bit about Rabbi Norman Lamm. Just before handing the mic over, I don't know if I shared this with you. When I was in 11th grade, I read Torah U'Madda, the newer version, the blue one, from cover to cover. And I actually had a meeting with Rabbi Lamm in his office. He was very gracious, gave me 30 minutes of his time, a young high schooler, sent me a letter afterwards, which will be hanging up in my office once I finish unpacking all the boxes. So Rabbi Lamm has a special place in my heart, but also I think really certainly within the heart of the intellectual side of modern orthodoxy, if you will. So enough about me. Maybe you want to share with our audience your connection to Rabbi Lamm. Tell us a little bit about him and the scenario that we're addressing today.
Rabbi Lamm was born in 1927 in Williamsburg, Brooklyn. It's a different Williamsburg, different kind of environment. His family is kind of modern Orthodox, but also has heavy Hasidic roots. His maternal grandfather is actually a great Hasidic rabbi and also tremendous Talmid Chacham, Rabbi Yoshua Baumel. And ultimately, he goes to Torah Das, and he takes the then not quite as rare route of then enrolling in Yeshiva University. He's there as an undergraduate, 1945 to 1949. He's torn between becoming a chemist and going into the Rabbanos. Dr. Belkin, who was his own teacher at the time, Zichrono Livracha, persuades him actually to go into the rabbinate, and ultimately that's the route he ultimately takes. In 1951, 1952, he starts off his rabbinic career as a rabbinic intern to Rabbi Joseph Lookstein, alav hashalom, then rabbi and the famed orator at KJ, Kilat Jeshurun, in the Upper East Side of Manhattan. He then goes actually down to Midtown in a kind of relatively unknown part of his rabbinic career, spends just 10 months, and this is a really confusing part of his biography, I find. He is the rabbi of what is then known as the West Side Jewish Center. And for listeners who are familiar with his 18-year tenure subsequently at the Jewish Center on the Upper West Side of Manhattan, and then you go into the archives, which of course is what it's occasioning this conversation, the launch of the new website, hosting Rabbi Lamm's archives, where all the documents that we're going to discuss actually appear. You find references to the Jewish Center or the West Side Jewish Center. And at first, when I was going through, I was quite confused how it was that he had two tenures at the Jewish Center. Turns out that that's true. They were just two different Jewish centers. Anyhow, so he's there for just 10 months, and then he comes to the period of time that we're going to be focusing on in just a few moments. He moves to Kehilat Kadima in Springfield, Massachusetts. He's there for 4.5 years as the rabbi, 1954 to 1958. So he's just a young man when he comes there, just I think 26 years old when he begins his tenure, and then 18 years from 1958 to 1976 at the Jewish Center back in Manhattan, the Upper West Side of Manhattan. And then, of course, 27 years as president and Rosh HaYeshiva of Yeshiva University and REITs, and then another 10 as chancellor. He retires as chancellor 2013, and he passes away in 2020.
Wow, that's a great overview just of his bio over there. Now, I tell me if I'm misremembering. I think when I spoke with my Rabbi Dr. Jacob J. Schachter, he would always tell me that Springfield, Rabbi Lamm's time there, was a really fruitful time for his research and self growth, as just being able to be out there and being able to study. Do you know anything about his time out there?
A little bit, yeah. I mean, as I say, he was there for 4.5 years. He's kind of out in the boondocks and kind of doing his old thing. He starts with the, out-of-town Ravanas. I don't know if you know anyone who finds himself in such a capacity. and he at first, he just kind of finds his sea legs. He just kind of, develops his place in the community. He meets the local rabbis. He, of course, starts to work with the congregation. But then very quickly, he's just a few short years out of smicha, and it's his first kind of full long-term rabbinic position. As I say, he was a rabbi in a community for about 10 months, but he was thinking about kind of moving on to the next opportunity. And once he settles in, he realizes that he doesn't have really a context for learning. He doesn't have a yeshiva. He doesn't have a framework. So he ultimately actually does something very interesting. He decides, instead of learning traditional masechtos or limudim in the classical sense, he decides he's going to designate a lot of his time in terms of his learning to topics that he wanted to research. It might have been beyond the scope of the knowledge base of his congregations. These are not preparations for shiur. That's just not where the community was holding at all, not even close to it. But he takes the opportunity. He pens a number of essays that ultimately, some of which appear in places like Hadarom, other classical rabbinic journals, when he launches Tradition toward the end of his time at Springfield in 1958. He publishes some of those there. Some of the earliest essays that he actually placed there, including the one on separate pews in a synagogue, which also grew out of his experience at Springfield. But all of that was based on his research, learning essentially his time for study. I
have to say that article, by the way, about the separate pews is, doesn't need my haskama, but it's remarkable. I just reread it recently because naturally for my Igros Moshe series, I naturally refer to it. So that article is amazing because he apparently reached the same conclusion as Rabbi Joseph B. Soloveitchik, that the reason that there should be separate seating is because mixed seating is a form of chukas akum, that we are emulating the ways of the other nations. But what I loved about Rabbi Lamm's analysis, and this kind of gets to the Torah Umada, that he actually went back, he looked at Philo and Josephus, and he confirmed that there was no record of ever having mixed seating. There was only a record of separate seating. And he basically flips the argument on its head. He says the onus of proof is on those who want to prove and change the norm to have mixed seating. And he showed also how even in Christianity, it was the Corinthians, they were learning, it was actually a more, pagan element of Christianity that introduced the mixed seating. So he said, not only are we emulating the ways of the Christians, but we're emulating the pagan origins that are mixed into Christianity. And that kind of essay could only be written by someone who was able to delve into the literature beyond the traditional rabbinic Jewish canon. And I actually, just before getting into our scenario for today, I mean, I kind of grew up at the end of Rabbi Lamm's career at YU, and certainly at the end of his life. And I only met him as he was kind of completing his time at YU. He was like just a few years shy of becoming chancellor when I met him. So what exactly got him to become the standard bearer of modern orthodoxy, of Torah Umada, which, in case our listener is not familiar, is the idea of mixing Torah and general knowledge together. This meant a lot to me. I grew up in a more yeshivish school, which, I love the Gemara education and everything I got there, but it was definitely not pro Torah Umada. So for me, it was so eye-opening. But what actually in Rabbi Lamm's life got him to become the standard bearer of Torah Umada? Do you have any sense of that?
For sure. It's definitely, and it's such a good question. And the answer is, it's fascinating because during his rabbinic career, even though he's writing this way, he almost never spoke about Torah Umada. He exemplified it, as you say. But note that he doesn't have, there are one or two, he has an article about synthesis and comparing and contrasting Rav Kook and Rav Hirsch. That's a relatively early one. But if you look at his sermons, for example, from the West Side Jewish Center all the way through the end of his tenure at the Jewish Center, 25 years. I don't believe he uses the terminology of Torah Umada more than once or twice in some 800 plus drashot that he preserved. So it wasn't something that he felt was urgent or important to talk about directly to the communities that he led at that time, but rather it was a personal passion. And it was interesting. He didn't have a year in Israel because he graduated high school in 1945. There was no Israel. Forget there was no year in Israel. There was no Israel. There was no
You're
state.
In Palestine.
Of course, at the time in Palestine, in between the wars, was not necessarily recommended as a great choice for a year of learning at that time for a whole host of obvious reasons. So he actually does this very interesting. He stays for one more year learning a Torah Vadas. He learns in the morning at yeshiva. He learns in the afternoon with his grandfather, Rabbi Baumel, whom I mentioned, who is, as Rabbi Lamm described him, a Hamisher Rav, who was not a Torah Umada-oriented Rav at all. That was not his background. He was receptive to it, and he was the one who actually pushed Rabbi Lamm to learn under Rabbi Soloveitchik at Yeshiva University over the, let's just say, less than happy responses of Rabbi Lamm's Rebbeim at Torah Vadas, to put it mildly. You can only imagine. And interestingly, the nights afterward, every evening, over the course of the week, during that quote-unquote year, in America learning, instead of the year in Israel, his gap year experience, he spent at the public library. And just on his own. His grandfather didn't encourage him to do so, but was certainly supportive. His parents were, I would say, they didn't even push him to do this, but they very much valued education. He earned a nickel for every new word that he learned, even though his parents were not particularly well off. I think that might be why his parents were not particularly well off. He had bankrupted
He learned
them.
a lot of words, I could tell that.
He came by it honestly, and he studied Freud. And he studied in that library that year. He studied chemistry. He read very, very, very widely. He fell in love with learning of all sorts, and he carried that to Yeshiva University. And he described it himself as kind of a love affair ever since. So it was just something that he found was just a process that he engaged with, and that he really grew through into becoming Norman Lamm. And when it became relevant to his leadership at Yeshiva University starting in 1976, at that point he started to put it front and center. But it was just who he was. It was the very, very essence, or at the very heart of his connection with HaKadosh Baruch Hu.
Beautiful. And okay, just one last little quick thing before we jump into the tshuva. I'd be remiss if you didn't actually share with our audience your personal connection to Rabbi Lamm.
Yes. Oh, full disclaimer. Absolutely. My connection to Rabbi Lamm is that I married the right person. As I always like to say, my wife is his eldest grandchild. I had the zechus of having to go through not one but two bechinos in order to be properly married off. Not only then my future father-in-law, but my future grandfather-in-law. They checked me out. Since I was dating the eldest grandchild, I was even known, don't tell your listeners, except I assume this will stay in, but I was known in the family and to Rabbi Lamm himself as the boy. In fact, his wife called me the boy because I was going around the family, but they did learn my name. They even allowed me to stay in the family and marry, and the rest is history. My wife Tova and I did also have the merit of learning with Rabbi Lamm shortly after he became chancellor over the course of 3 years in his fifth floor of a first hall office at Yeshiva University. We were in Zocha to a parking spot once a week, and thank God we had a very beautiful relationship.
Wow. Again, for listeners who've attended YU or been in Washington Heights, I mean, getting a parking spot for free, that's the truest form of devotion and expression of love that anyone in Washington Heights can give to family or friends. So I totally get that.
100%.
So thank you for sharing that with us. And so without any further ado, what is the Rabbi Lamm, as you said, has written so much. So what are we looking at today and why are we looking at it today?
Yeah, so thank you for that. And we're going to go back actually to our time discussing Rabbi Lamm's tenure in Springfield in particular. Because as you say, and as you asked, and as you observed in the name of Rabbi Schachter, this really was a very fruitful time for him as not only a rabbi, but as a scholar as well. And although it's true that many of the essays that he penned had to do with other topics or, were peripheral to his work in the Rabbanos there in Springfield, this tshuva is not. When Rabbi Lamm comes in 1954 to Springfield, he immediately observes that birchas kohanim, that duchening, is on the decline. He observes, and he actually describes it in what ultimately became an article that he published in Hapardes. I'll just read for you the way that he describes the situation. He says that over the course of our exile, that unfortunately we have been losing the opportunity to recite birchas kohanim. And he says toward the beginning of this essay, Uvirvos hashanim, over the course of these years, as kenim ele holchim olamam, the elders are now, who knew birchas kohanim, they're passing away. Ein kan pirche kahuna likanes lemitzvah yikara zo. There are no young kohanim who are trained and knowledgeable enough to simply duchen, to recite these tefillos. And he even says that it seems that if this trend continues, lo tihiyah dat Yisrael chalila shruya below bracha. He wants to forestall a scenario in which the Jewish communities, especially those on the outskirts of major centers of Jewish life, will be bereft without a bracha, without the recitation and the opportunity to hear birchas kohanim. So he picks up this issue and he observes and he asks around. He says to his community members, why aren't you duchening? What's going on? They say, well, Rabbi, we drive to shul on Shabbos. We can't duchen. That's not something that's a possibility for us. Now, the part about driving to shul on Shabbos,
that they, even though they were driving to shul on Shabbos, they had the sense to self-censor themselves from the duchening.
That's right. They understood, said, Rabbi, I'm not frum. I know you. I want this, right? I understand his congregants, even though conservatism was, capital C conservatism, was of course on the rise in the 1950s, nonetheless, his congregants understand, many of them understand that Orthodox is authentic, that halacha is true. I may not have been raised this way. I may not practice this way, but I'm not, and maybe some of them parked in the shul parking lot. I'm not sure what they did at that time, but they understood. They understood the concept that they were doing something that was incorrect and that was not properly observant, and therefore, absolutely not. And it turns out that actually this was commonplace across the United States. This is the standard practice in Orthodox shuls, that someone who was not Shomer Shabbos, whether they drove to shul that morning, they didn't drive to shul that morning, would go ahead and would say, I cannot duchen for the Amud. And you even have scenarios that I've heard of. Rabbi Lamm doesn't mention these, but at that time in the 50s, you have people in various communities, Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, who are Mechalelei Shabbos, who drive, generally speaking, would otherwise drive on Rosh Hashanah, on Yom Kippur to shul without batting an eyelash, but nonetheless they know, or they think, that if I drive to shul today, I may not duchen. So you have kohanim who at that time in various communities would say, can I go and stay at your home, Yankel, because you're Shomer Shabbos? Can I stay at your home for Yom Kippur? I'll sleep over the night before. So this way I can walk to shul on Yom Kippur morning and duchen properly without being in violation of the halacha of duchen. Of course, they might have, driven after Shkia to their friend's house.
But I always, I have the privilege, my previous shul and my current shul. I'm very grateful that we have, I think we quoted Rabbi J.J. Schachter before. So Rabbi J.J. Schachter, I think he always loved to share Yarchei Kalas that he once berated a rabbi that he went to serve a scholar in residence at a shul, and the rabbi proudly said, our shul, I'm so proud, is 100% Shabbos observant. Right. And Rabbi Schachter says, Shaita Shabba'ilam, that means all the people who are not Shabbos observant don't feel comfortable coming to your shul. It's not that you were successfully makarim everybody. So, I think it's just beautiful that people understand there's certain mitzvos that everyone struggles with. And, some people have easier scenarios. Some people don't. They have their own personal, cheshbonos. I get it. But the fact that they're saying it's not an all or nothing, I understand I struggle with Shabbos, but it doesn't mean I'm throwing in the towel on everything else. It's not a zero-sum game.
Yeah, 100%. And this was something that was very formative for Rabbi Lamm because it helped him to develop this notion that he kept not only throughout his rabbinate, but really throughout his career, that our role is to, on the one hand, maintain the highest possible halachic standards and not compromise in the sense that we say, well, you're not Shomer Shabbos, therefore we're not going to encourage you to increase your Shabbos observance, to become as observant as possible. But at the same time, to recognize the beauty and the good that is present in everyone, and to encourage that access to mitzvos and that increased observance of mitzvos through ahavas haTorah, through ahavas Hashem, through ahavas habrios, and through positive engagement and ultimately respectful engagement, where he was able to see the beauty in even the congregants who are not Shomer Shabbos, just as you say. So I couldn't agree more.
Right. So I was taught this when I was a rabbinic intern giving a shiur. I remember one time I gave a shiur on can women hold the Sifrei Torah on Simchas Torah. That was a shiur I gave, and I immediately launched into explaining why it was mutter. But I realized I was informed pedagogically from Rabbi Eli Weissman that before asking why something's mutter, we first have to ask why it's usser. So, before we start asking why it might be mutter, like, why would it be usser? Okay, so he's Mechal Shabbos, but, Ma Inyan Shemitah Eitzal Har Sinai, what does that have to do with duchening?
Yeah, 100%. So that's exactly the question that he addresses. He says, why is this? I understand there's a beauty, as you say, to 100% that he appreciates as well, to saying, okay, I'm not Shomer Shabbos, not going to duchen, but really, right, what would be the reason not to do so? So the truth is that the Gemara addresses a different scenario. The Gemara addresses a kohen who is Oved Avodah Zarah, an idolater. The Gemara says very clearly, on the basis of what appears to be Gzeras HaKosov, a special limud from the Pesukim, that a kohen who is idolatrous is barred from duchening, is barred from reciting Birchas Kohanim. Now, that's just one scenario. Then the Rambam comes along when he codifies this halacha. He gives that case as well as other cases. And then we know that the Rambam himself elsewhere says, well, the Rambam makes 2 points that are pertinent. Number one, the Rambam says that there are scenarios that if someone is intentionally a violator of halacha, what we call a mumar lahachis, someone who intentionally violates other halachos in the Torah, such an individual is barred from reciting Birchas Kohanim. That's number one, okay, under certain scenarios. And number two, right, he says that we know that a mumar la'avodah zarah is a mumar l'chol haTorah kula. So regardless, right, even if I'm not someone who is not a mumar davarecha, but rather a mumar, right, for the majority of mitzvos, that someone who is an oved avodah zarah is compared to such an individual. Those are the 2 points that the Rambam establishes that are immediately pertinent. And then the Rambam adds to that elsewhere in a classic formulation based on the Gemara in Maseches Chulin, that someone who is Mechal Shabbos is compared to someone who is who's oved avodah zarah.
Right, so because Shabbos is an acknowledgement of the creation of the world, so violating Shabbos is tantamount to a denial of God creating the world. Is that the
That's
idea?
right. Although we're going to come back to that because the question then becomes, well, what happens if I accept that Hashem is the creator of the world? And what happens if I say Kiddush at home on Friday night? What happens if I'm driving to shul, right? To daven and to participate in the community's prayers on Shabbos? This is a relatively new halachic scenario that Rabbi Lamm is coming to and he's going to address.
Right. I mean, I guess the question is how well it's known, but correct me if I'm mistaken. A similar scenario was addressed by the Binyan Sion, I believe,
Yeah, absolutely.
already
Yeah.
prior to this.
Yeah.
Which you
Yeah.
mean? Okay, I don't
100%.
want to. I'll let you tell us that.
No. 100%. I'll make that point now, and then we'll kind of then retrace kind of the steps here. But 100%, part of Rabbi Lamb's puzzlement as he comes to the practical issues on the table is he says, wait a second, I can see one theoretically arriving at different halachic conclusions as to under the question, under what circumstances is someone who is a Shabbos violator considered to be like a Momer L'chol Torah Kula, like someone who's Oved Avodah Zarah, and therefore is precluded from engaging in a variety of mitzvos, including Birchas Kohanim. That's fine. But as soon as we count them toward, for example, a minyan, as the classic Shuva, the Binyan Sion, suggests, as soon as we similarly rule like the Ma'amid Lahoil, Rav David Tzvi Hoffman, and others as well, who permit someone who is Mechal Shabbos to join in a minyan for these purposes. So then why would we distinguish between, for example, counting someone for a minyan or giving them an aliyah in shul or, or allowing them to lead a zimun or whatever it might be and Birchas Kohanim? He doesn't believe there's any halachic basis for that conclusion.
Right. And just to clarify, make sure it's clear for our listeners, the basic assertion is that if I'm making Kiddush on Shabbos, I'm going to davening on Shabbos, and I'm working on Shabbos, you can't say that I'm working on Shabbos means that I deny that there's a God and there's Shabbos, because clearly I just did something. I made Kiddush, which is literally acknowledging Shabbos. So there might be, it is still problematic that I'm working on Shabbos, but it's not tantamount to a theological declaration and rejection of God. So that's essentially the idea, if I recall correctly.
Yeah, no, that's exactly what Rabbi Lamm argues, and that's ultimately what he says. His line of argument is essentially as follows. He says, look, the reason that someone who is a Shabbos violator is precluded from reciting Birchas Kohanim, from duchening, such a Kohen is excluded because he is thereby theologically blasphemous, thereby denying that God created the world. Well, once we say, as we do rule, that such an individual is counted toward a minyan, and once we observe that such individuals are implicitly accepting the notion of God as creator because they do accept the Shabbos in significant measure, in significant other ways, obviously not entirely, but nonetheless, the postulate that God is creator is not what they are intending in any way to undermine by driving on Shabbos or turning on lights or what have you, but rather they're just simply acting the way that they were raised themselves. So then it doesn't make sense to declare such a person to be theologically engaged in inappropriate behavior or in inappropriate theology, rather, and therefore it does not make sense to exclude such an individual from duchening.
Right.
Yeah, go ahead.
So I guess two things. One is that's a great encapsulation, I believe, of what he gets to in his psak. Two things. One is I'm wondering, is there anything in terms of his methodology and how he arrived there that you found noteworthy that you want to share? And then the second part, which I thought was interesting, is I think you mentioned this was published, at least the copy you gave me, it says Hadarom on it. So yeah. I'm curious about why and the nature of where he published it and the broader audience that he seemed to have been writing this for as well.
Yeah, 100%. Those are both great questions. Let me actually go backwards in terms of your two questions, if I may. I'll answer. I'll achron rishon. I know there's one ma'amar chazal's, one teaching that you're supposed to answer in order, but there are many other examples in the Gemara and elsewhere one goes the other way. So yes. we can write a separate tshuva and have a different podcast about that. But b'mechila, I'll go in that order. I think that what Rabbi Lamm is trying to do is he wants the world to know that when some more modern rabbi who learned at Yeshiva University was going ahead and adopting a leniency, someone associated with the Rabbinical Council of America, for example, and not the Agudas HaRabbanim, which is more right-leaning within the kind of the broader scope of the Orthodox community at that time as well as ours. He wanted readership, he wanted rabbis, rabbinic leadership, and rabbinic scholars in particular, which is, as I think you were perhaps implying, or at least asking about, is the readership of Hadarom, to know, and not that Norman Lamm is such a scholar necessarily, but to know that when some rabbi out in Springfield does this, he's doing so on the basis of real halachic argumentation. This isn't some haaretz, this isn't some ignoramus who's going out and saying, "Oh, I feel badly for my kohanim, and therefore I'm going to, God forbid, violate halacha or not take halacha 100% seriously." And recall, as I mentioned earlier, this is a time of tremendous anxiety, and rightfully so, among the Orthodox community with regard to the ascendancy and success of the conservative movements. YU and the Jewish Theological Seminary at that time are much closer to one another. There are numerous Orthodox synagogues that are closing down only to be taken over by conservative rabbis. Marshall Sclair, the famed sociologist, is declaring that within 50 years we will see the demise of Orthodoxy in the United States of America. So Rabbi Lamm is at tremendous pains to reassure observers and readers that that's not what's going on here. This is not someone who's basically a conservative rabbi. There's no personal animus, of course, toward conservative rabbis. He values the work that they do for sure, but he wants to reassure that that's not what's happening here in terms of the halachic argumentation. So I think that's very much
that's a good point. Certainly because since this is written in a rabbinic style Hebrew, I mean, I would imagine his actual community is not the main audience here. He's clearly trying to project this to a broader audience. And to, like what you're saying, perhaps an audience that resides a little bit to the right of him. Though, correct me if I'm wrong, this is Hadarom. It's not like Hamaor or Hapardes. Hadarom, I think, is still kind of like a YU or YU adjacent publication, or RCA maybe.
Yeah, that's right. And that comes to the other point that I was going to make. That's a perfect segue, which is that he actually, Hadarom is indeed affiliated with the Rabbinical Council of America. It's just that it's read by something of a broader audience to the right as well. And the reason that it's natural for him to publish here is because actually what he does is, on the one hand, his halachic argumentation seems very straightforward, but at the same time, it was not the common practice at all. So this is could be taken as somewhat of a maverick move. And he's a young rabbi. He's independent-minded, and he's certainly creative. We'll come back to that. But he wants to make sure that he's, covering his bases, both halachically as well as, communally as well. And so he actually goes to Rabbi Soloveitchik, who, in addition to Rabbi Baumel, whom I mentioned, his grandfather, is his primary Rebbe. He learned in the Rav Shir for a number of years at YU and remained close with him over the course of the remainder of the Rav's life through, of course, Rabbi Lamm's time at YU. And the Rav at that time was wearing the hat of the chair of the RCA's, the Rabbinical Council of America's Halacha Commission. So Rabbi Lamm takes it to the Halacha Commission. There's a vote. There's a unanimous vote that the RCA approves this psak, this ruling. And Rabbi Lamm, I'm not sure that they necessarily asked him to write it up, but he wanted to write it up to demonstrate not only in his behalf, but on behalf of the RCA, that again, this is rigorous rabbinical reasoning, halachic reasoning, rather than just some rabbi out there.
Did people, I mean, I don't want to get too controversial. Maybe I'm the outlier here. My sense is today, if the RCA puts out a psak, I'm an RCA member, that doesn't really shift my thinking on the matter. Back then, if the RCA came out with a decision, maybe because Rev Soloveitchik was the head of the Halacha committee, does that mean if the RCA says jump, we ask how high? Is that what it was like back in the day? Or, is this revisionism?
I don't think so. Yeah, no, I don't think that that's quite right, but I do think that that at that time, or an Orthodox, capital O, without a question, in the perception of the community members, that such an organization was supportive of this move, is important to community members who wanted authentic orthodoxy. Recall that the community members themselves didn't necessarily have any background whatsoever, overwhelmingly, with very few exceptions. Overwhelmingly not Shomer Shabbos. Jewish day schools barely existed, certainly for his congregants. There's almost no Jewish education. There are a few examples for another time, but overwhelmingly not. And so for them, it's very important, I think, to hear that this psak is something that comes from a rabbinic body, and it's not the only time that Rabbi Lamm goes to the RCA for guidance, or at least for confirmation of his views.
Now, I just want to actually sharpen your point. I think we could appreciate Rabbi Lamm if we see him maybe in contrast to other discussions that were happening at the time. I think there is, so I looked this up just to make sure. In the first Chelek Vorchaim in Igros Moshe, there is actually a tshuva dated to Mar Cheshvan Tafshin Yud. So I think it's roughly around the same time. We're talking about just at the turn of the 1950s over here, or shortly before that. The title is B'dvar Mechali Shabbos B'far Hesia Le'inyan Nesiyas Kapayim. Literally the same exact topic, but his conclusion seems to be different than Rabbi Lamm. His conclusion is Nimsa Shaladina Ein Laposo. He agrees that as far as strict halacha is concerned, they would not be disqualified. But what he adds is Avla Maisa After Yesh Bezet Mishum Migdar Milsa. He says, but there might be an element that if we can, to prevent them just as a safeguard, just to ensure our standards are maintained. And, that's the kind of psak that I think one can give maybe out of the Lower East Side versus a psak perhaps in Springfield, in a very out-of-town place where setting up these kind of gezeras might have the opposite effect. I mean, in an out-of-town community, community building is such an essential part of what the rabbi does. Now, obviously, you don't want to sacrifice halachic integrity, but I would imagine Rabbi Lamm was looking to bring people into the shul, not to move them away from the shul. So that to me is an interesting point of contrast between them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that that's really important because it speaks to Rabbi Lamm's broader perspective on there being on being strict in these ways. Concerns for Moshe doesn't say slippery slope, so I don't want to contrast it in this respect to Moshe, but concerns of slippery slope, those kinds of arguments kind of being double-edged swords. And he recognizes it, that every single decision there's no such thing as a fully neutral decision, and that every single chumrah is associated with kulos. And he knew this, and he practiced this over the course of his rabbinic career. Now, I would add that this was not only true when he was out of town. This was the practice that may have already been in place, but one gets the sense that he would have done the same at the Jewish Center and perhaps other pulpits. So I think in addition to your general observation about the uniqueness of an out-of-town type of community, I think it also just generally has to do with his mindset, that it's 1950s, Orthodox Judaism and certain key practices that are associated with frumkeit and with our communities need to continue. It's essential, and that sometimes it's okay to say we're going to have a partial victory. That, too, is a meaningful achievement, a meaningful victory in its own right.
100%. So are there any other highlights from this particular article or tshuva? I'm not sure what you want to call it. We'll call it tshuva for the sake of the show. That way we could say we talked about tshuvas on the show. I mean, I think it's interesting in general that a lot of Rabbanim, what they wrote in journals like Hapardes HaMaor were then subsequently published as tshuvas. The Satmar Rebbe, when he takes on Rav Moshe on artificial insemination, it then later on gets printed in his tshuvos. So I think, actually what this might be a good opportunity is that I believe you also recently published a collection of Rabbi Lamm's Hebrew essays, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes, true. Guilty as charged. Yeah.
So there is kind of a post facto, I don't know if you would call it a Sefer Shalos, a Tshuvos per se, but, you want to just tell our listeners a little bit about your other work on Rabbi Norman Lamm?
Sure, of course. So recently, Rabbi Lamm, well, let me go back a little bit. In 1992, I believe it was, Rabbi Lamm published what was then his first collection of halachic and lamdisha essays. And that was entitled Halachos V'Halichos. And those themselves were a collection of many of the articles they did publish in places like Hadarom and in Hapardes and in Beis Yitzchak, the Yeshiva University, a rabbinic journal. Many of those were based on shiurim that he delivered on an annual basis in memory of Dr. Belkin, who was his predecessor, as his own teacher, as I mentioned, also his predecessor as president of Yeshiva University in commemoration of his yahrzeit, and he put those together. It's very interesting. We think of Rabbi Lamm, I think, very much Torah Umada, and a community leader, and a pulpit rabbi, and a speaker, and a darshan, and all these things. But Rabbi Lamm, the lamdan, gets lost in the shuffle. It wasn't his job. Interestingly, he did actually give a shiur in Yeshiva University for 1 year. I believe it was his second year as president. He gave shiur, I think, on Psachim. Yeah, I believe it was on Maseches Psachim. It didn't last. It wasn't at all realistic. I don't know.
As a president, no way.
He also, it wasn't only him he was giving. I don't know. I actually don't know. I have to try to figure out who gave the shiur of the Shutfos in partnership with him. I don't know. I haven't yet found it in the archives, and I never even knew to ask Rabbi Lamm because I found it posthumously. So I'll keep on digging around, or maybe a listener knows. Let me know. Let either of us know. But it's very interesting that Rabbi Lamm, the lamdan, is not well known. Then he, after 1992, he continued to deliver many shurim, continued to publish many articles, and a few years before he passed away, we had a conversation. He asked me essentially to take these, put them together, and publish these as a collected volume, as kind of a companion volume to the first, and that ultimately is entitled Al Harishonim Ve'al Ha'achronim, and that's a second collection of his Lamdish essays. And you see his virtuosity in Lamdus. You see the way that he's not a card-carrying brisker in the sense that he's trying to, in a kind of a narrow way, parrot the Rav's approach, or even to apply the Rav's approach in a new way. It's sort of an amalgam between his grandfather's classical, kind of more achronish style, and the Rav's greater focus on Rishonim and on sharpening Svaros. And he puts these two together with an emphasis, of course, on Agadah, right? In other words, the notion, not only is a darshan, he's going to integrate that, but it also, as the Rav did himself, of course, so he's getting this from one of his own Rebbeim at the Rav's yahrzeit shurim in memory of his own father, Rav Moshe Soloveitchik, Zecher Tzadik Livracha. But what we have is Rabbi Lamm essentially kind of marrying all these different pieces, and actually touches on Torah Umada. Right? It's interestingly enough, because Torah Umada, if you recall from the book, Rabbi Lamm's favorite approach to Torah Umada is actually the Hasidic approach, and it's analogous to a Rav Kookian approach that essentially says that everything is permeated with Kedusha, with sanctity, and therefore this is all part of Hashem's creation, and so that is true. In other words, all of wisdom and all of the world is organically, ultimately created, connected to the Ribono Shel Olam, to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. It's a form of revelation. What's true of Torah Umada is certainly true of Halacha and Agadah. He doesn't see them as two distinct spheres. Yeah. They are two distinct disciplines and have different methodologies, but ultimately they're two sides of the same.
I think when I read the book, I started there, and I think nowadays I'm more at the instrumental approach. So I've shifted between models of Torah Umada over time, but I still consider myself within the Torah Umada camp. Actually, this might be a good place for us to conclude with a final question. And certainly, if there's anything else about Rabbi Lamm you want to share, this is your opportunity to do it. But I'm curious, and this is a little bit open-ended. I kind of remember reading Torah Umada again when I was in high school. I went up to YU, to Washington Heights. It's kind of funny because my vision of YU is all abstract. I never been to Washington Heights, so we're on our way to YU, and we get off the Harlem River Drive, I believe it is, and we come into Washington Heights, and then the person driving says, "We're here," and I'm like, I think you made a wrong turn. Pretty sure we're supposed to go across the bridge to New Jersey. There's supposed to be a campus full of lush trees where everyone's reading Lonely Man of Faith under all their date palms or whatever. So that was kind of my vision of what YU looked like. And I'm not sure. Maybe this is revisionist. Maybe at some point in the YU history, A large part of the culture was really centered around Torah Umada. I do wonder if you have a sense of what it was like even during the heyday, but I'm also curious of your sense of where we're going in the future. Is modern Orthodoxy still see Torah Umada as its central motto and philosophy, or has it gone in a different direction? I came to modern Orthodoxy because I believe in Torah Umada. Whatever, we could talk about which chapter in the book, which model of Torah Umada, but I firmly believe, like when I read, the broader commentaries on the Torah, or I look at the sciences and informs everything, I buy into that. It's beautiful, it's wonderful, but I don't see that much. I don't see Torah Umada as the central pillar of modern Orthodoxy as it maybe once was. I'm curious what your thoughts on it are. And so anything about that, or Rabbi Norman Lamm, for our listeners before we conclude?
Yeah, no, for sure. It's such an important question. We have opposite experiences in this respect because I grew up in the Heilige Teaneck, New Jersey, most of the way. It's actually born and bred in Flatbush. I was almost 5, though, when we moved to the suburbs. That, too, is a modern Orthodox move, the flight to the suburbs. I lived that myself. I grew up in Teaneck. I went to classical, traditional modern Orthodox institutions. I have numerous degrees from YU. I did my time, Baruch Hashem. And what I would say is, I don't think that Rabbi Lamm imagined, or that I imagined, that this was ever kind of a cultural norm in the community, that there were these halcyon days when everyone, as you say, ish tachas kafno, tachas
Exactly.
no, right? So Shabbos Nachu is coming up, like all these, messianic, fertile visions. It's not only a function of Washington Heights, for those who have been there and no, it's right. It's not an oasis, but that was really never the norm in the community as a whole, because what we're talking about is people, as you say, who have many, many different responsibilities. Even Rabbi Lamm acknowledged that Parnassa is important. He just didn't think that was the be all and end all of the acquisition of knowledge. But I think that Rabbi Lamm did recognize that two things, and I think this is what I'd conclude with, is that number one, that if we turn all knowledge into something that's only instrumental, it's not only hurtful to our community or to Torah Umada in some larger sense, but it's hurtful to our soul. If all of life, we live in a highly utilitarian age, if the only question we ask ourselves on every single thing that we do is, how is this going to help me advance in my life? How is this going to help me in my career? How is this going to help me earn more money, and so on and so forth? Even, forgive me, Rabbi Kurtz, how is this going to help me paskin the next Shiloh? That's important, obviously, right? Or, as you say, instrumental, I'm using it there, of course, in a more narrow way. So I don't mean to describe that to you. But I think Rabbi Lamm understood that HaKadosh Baruch Hu gave us a neshama. The neshama seeks transcendence. HaKadosh Baruch Hu gave us a bria. He gave us a world. The Mada itself, the larger creation, he actually, for another time, believe it or not, preferred Chachma even more than Mada, but for another conversation, that world in which we are engaging, that is a gift. HaKadosh Baruch Hu gave us curiosity. He wanted us to cultivate that curiosity. So I don't think Rabbi Lamm has ever lived in a world or ever imagined a world in which we're all just sitting around luxuriating in Torah Umada all day long, maybe Yemos HaMashiach, but we're certainly not there yet, right? So you can imagine
like a separate modern Orthodox based medrash in Gan Eden.
You got it, yeah. And you can continue reading Torah Umada, and we can argue to our heart's content which of Rabbi Lamm's models of Torah Umada is true, right? This is what Mashiach comes for. Perhaps I guess we'll find out. But I think that that's number one, is that this is a personal aspiration, is to agree to a communal aspiration, but we shouldn't reimagine history as it never was, or reimagine the normal course of everyday human life to be something that it is not. This is something the neshama craves. This is a gift that HaKadosh Baruch Hu gave us. We should aspire toward that within realistic limitations, and that's acceptable. But we dare not starve our soul of spiritual sustenance in a broader sense. That's number one. But I think the other thing that Rabbi Lamm's career very much exemplified, and it goes back to this tshuva, is this sense of, well, maybe the future is not yet written. Maybe it's up to us to contribute to and to help in some small but meaningful measure to help determine the course of what our community will be. You asked the question, well, is this on the decline? Or what will be of Torah Umada? What will be of modern orthodoxy? Rabbi Lamm had, you'll forgive me, no patience for these questions. He couldn't care less. He would say, and this is what he did for his entire career, and they're beautiful orations where he basically says, we can talk and talk from today till tomorrow, but what we really need to do is to roll up our sleeves, dig into the work, and create the world that we want to see. He came to far-flung communities like Springfield, Massachusetts, and he said, there's no birchas kohanim. I'm concerned it will disappear. But he didn't just write an essay, right? He didn't just, complain or what have you.
He just pontificated about it.
Right? Yeah, exactly. No, he learned the sugya. He arrived at a halachic conclusion. He passed it by his Rebbe. He ran it by the Halachic Commission. He then brought it back to his community. We didn't go through this. It's not in this tshuva, but he then actually had kohanim training seminars for his kohanim before the chagim. We have a letter in the archives. Everyone's welcome to you can just search for Kadima or Springfield Kohanim Training Institute or something like that, and you'll find the letter that he sent his community encouraging them to engage in this practice. And so it was throughout his rabbinic career and throughout his university presidency and chancellorship as well. And I think it's a tremendously humbling charge that even a young man, 27 years old now, less than a year into his pulpit, starts seeing these issues and tries to create the world that he wants to see. So you asked me, what will be the future? Will it be Torah Umada? What will be with Torah Umada? I don't know the answer to that question, but I really don't care. We have our principles. HaKadosh Baruch Hu gave us the gift of the Torah, of his wisdom, of Torah Umada, but really all the things that we hold dear. And I think Rabbi Lamm would have reminded us to simply get to work and create the world that it is we want to see.
A beautiful lesson and message to conclude with. And again, Rabbi Dr. Sinensky, it's wonderful to have you on today and continue hatzlacha in perpetuating the legacy of Rabbi Dr. Norman Lamm Zatzal. And I'm looking forward to seeing the archives up soon, B'shat Tov u'Mitzlachas, and we'll make sure to link it here on the podcast as well. That way our esteemed listeners can go check out the archives and actually dig into it for themselves as well. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure, Rabbi Kurtz.